In this video, I'm going to show you how you can use a pivot table in Excel to help you count unique values. So in this example here, I've got computer shipments broken down by company and by year. And so let's say I want to count the number of companies in this report. So first, I'm going to create a pivot table here by going Insert, Pivot Table, and I'm just going to put it next to my data set here. And so there are a couple ways that we can do this count. One is I can just grab the company field, drag it to the rows section, and now I've got a list of all the companies that are in that field. So I can manually count these, of course, but I can also have Excel do the counting for me. For example, if I select all these values here, in the status bar down here, Excel's told me that the count is 7. And so if you're not seeing this, you'll want to right-click on your status bar and make sure you have count checked off as one of the things that your status bar is going to track. So you'll notice I also have average, I've got sum, I can select maximum and minimums as well. And this is basically telling Excel what I want it to do anytime I make a selection. So in this case, doing a count. And this works for other things as well. So for example, I select all these values here. I know that the average is this is the count, and this is the sum of those values. In this case, these are text values, so it's just doing a count. But that's an example of how we can combine pivot tables with the status bar to help us do a count. Again, you could obviously do this yourself, but by just making the selection, looking at your status bar, you can see how many items you've counted. So that's a quick way if you just want to do a quick spot check of how many unique values you have. But if you actually want to count the values and have them show up in your pivot table report, then what we're going to do is create an extra column here, a helper column to do a count of unique values. So I'm going to call this unique count. And for this to work, I'm going to use the countif function. And what the countif function does is it looks at a range and counts the number of times your criteria shows up in that range. So the range that I'm going to look at is column B, the company field. And I'm going to look at every time the value, in this case, cell B2 shows up in this list. And then as I drag this formula down, it's going to look at B3, B4, B5, and so on. So I'm going to close this out. And so it tells me that Lenovo shows up 10 times on this list, right? If I copy this down, HP also shows up 10 times. But I don't want it to return a value of 10. Instead, I want it to add up to a value of 1. So what I'm going to do is add a 1 divided by indicator before this. And now it's going to turn that into a fraction. So now if I add some decimal places, you can see that now 1 divided by 10 is going to be 0.10. And if there are 10 instances of that, it's going to add up to 10. So that logic is going to allow the values to add up to 1. Whether I've got 100 items, whether I've got 1,000, it's always going to add up to 1. Just because I've set it up so it's going to be 1 divided by the number of times it shows up. So I'm going to copy this down. And now what I can do is go back to my pivot table here. And I'm going to need to update the range here. Because right now I've got it. So it's going up until column C. We go to pivot table analyze, change the data source, and update it so it also includes column D. And now I've got my unique count showing up on here. So now if I drag this into my value section, you'll see the sum is always going to be 1. So regardless of how many items I've got in here, it's always going to add up to 1 just because I've got this fraction set up here. And now my grand total tells me that there's 7. So that represents my unique count. So again, whether I'm doing it manually, whether I'm using the countif function, pivot table makes it really easy to tell me these unique values. There's other ways that you can do unique counts without a pivot table, but the benefit of a pivot table is you also have a list of what they look like, what they are, so you can see exactly what makes up what makes up that total. For instance, in this example, I see that others are making up one of those unique values. So I may think, okay, maybe I don't want to include that in my tally, or maybe my tally should be larger than this just because there are other values that are making up this value. So there could actually be a lot more than just 7, right? They're just being grouped in this others category. So it gives you a bit more insight into what's making up that tally of unique values. But with the help of a pivot table, you can see that just within seconds of creating a pivot table, just grab the field that you want to look at unique values for, and it'll list all those values that appear in your data set. So really easy to use pivot tables to not only count your unique values, but also see what the unique values are.